As we get started, I want to just have us take a moment to connect with ourselves and with the land. So I ask for you to just take a few deep breaths. Try to center yourselves in this moment, in this time, in this place. Maybe put both your feet on the floor. Be reminded of your connection to the land. Be reminded of the gift of all the plants that surround us, the animals that surround us, the air we get to breathe in, the ocean so close by. Take just a moment to be in gratitude for all those good gifts. As you do that, I want to acknowledge the land that we're on and the history of the land that we're on. We gather on ancestral lands of the Lekwungen and Saanich peoples. I stand here as someone who is a settler on unceded land. As a congregation, we're working to try to live into reconciliation with integrity and honesty, to be part of that journey, and to be in a place of learning from the first peoples of this place. So I ask us all to just keep that in mind through this evening, and to keep in mind for all of us the possibilities of a new way of living together. And that part of what we're called to is to have hope and live into that hope, that we all can live in a new way together. I'm just going to offer a brief prayer. Holy One, we give thanks for the beauty of this earth, the beauty of this place, for all the good gifts of this earth, the land and the air and the waters, the animals and the insects. We give thanks for this community of people who are gathered to learn and be in conversation. And we ask for you to help us have open hearts and open minds, to be reminded that we are one community, one people, in relationship with all of creation. And may you help us walk together in a good way this evening and always. Amen. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome our speaker for this evening, Adam Olsen, BC Green Party MLA for North Saanich and the Gulf Islands. Many of you probably know a little bit about him, but let me give you a little bit of background. He was born here in Victoria. He's worked and lived and played his whole life on the Saanich Peninsula, so he has very deep roots and relationship to this land. He is a member of the Sartlip First Nation, where he and his family live. He is someone who I have seen really engage with the community, with everyday real life struggles we all have for how to live well together. He's someone who considers the needs not only of the people who are present now, but of generations coming up after us. And he's someone who I think serves from the heart. And so it's a gift for us to have him here tonight to speak to us. I had the great gift to speak with him briefly on the phone when we were able to be assured that he was going to be able to come speak, and then he arrived a bit early and I was able to speak with him again, and I'm just excited to hear more from him. So I ask at this time that you put your hands together to welcome him.
More that we talked, the more I realized having a conversation about decolonization requires more than 45 minutes. And all of the things that I've written on these pieces of paper here, none of which that we talked about is on this paper. So I'll start with this. Ait squachel halet siem na ait jalacha. It's hanap tenatsane. Chislea Seneth Saanich, Lea Wathothla Beat Lungs. Good evening, good day. My Coast Salish name is Saanich. I'm from the Saanich territory, Saanich, and I was born and raised on the Huachotlip village, or in the Huachotlip village, commonly known as Sartlip. It's Brentwood Bay, and it's the place on the very same piece of property that my family who are here tonight, Emily and our children, Silas and Ella, the younger two members of the audience over here, we live on the exact same property that I was raised on. And so we have a very strong sense of home, a very strong sense of place, and it was a great place to grow up, and it's been a great place to raise kids. I am a mixed heritage person, if you haven't noticed. I don't have long, flowing, dark hair or dark brown eyes that come from my father's side. I have very much the Snowblin hairline, and my mom is European ancestry, British, German ancestry. My father is Coast Salish with a dash of Scottish and maybe a dash of Norwegian, hence the Olsen. So I come from a very mixed heritage, as many do in Canada, come from a mixed heritage. I would say that nowhere or no other mix in Canada is as, I'd say special, but as pronounced as the one that I have. There's no other mix in this country, there's no other people in this country that have a special piece of legislation that legislates every single part of their life as the Indian people in this country, under the Indian Act, federal legislation. And growing up on the reserve, growing up under the Indian Act, in an Indian Act community, you have no choice but to be politicized. And every single part of life on the reserve is political. There is no aspect of it which you can escape the politicization. So, for me to then work my way into local government and then into the provincial government, for a kid like me with the skills that the talents that I was born with, and I use that word, the talents that I was born with, the ability to speak, the love for people, the love to network and build relationships with people, politics, being a politicized person, politics was a natural place for me to go. Governance was a natural place for me to go because the Indian Act is about governing. It's about governing people, and it's a colonial piece of legislation about how a colonial government governs the Indigenous people that were here prior to contact. Going back to the culture, the Coast Salish, the Saanich culture, and the creation stories that highlight how all of the living creatures within this territory, the trees and the plants and the animals that surround us all, how they all got here. There are some very beautiful stories that start to unpack the relationship that the Huilngu, the people, had with the nature that surrounded them. And I've been hearing these stories recently from my family members. They talk about the Staitnuch, the salmon, the hardest working people. The Chapay, the cedar, the kind people. And in each one of these stories, as I've been listening and hearing them from my family, there is an aspect of this which we can't escape. At the time when the Creator, Cant, transforms the hardest working people that he could find into the schools of salmon that work so hard, he said, you look after them, and they will look after you. And then he turned to the remaining people that were standing, and he said, you look after them, and they will look after you. And this was an agreement. It was a contract. It was a relationship that was to be enshrined. We were to look after the hardest working people, and they would continue to work hard and feed us. And it was their job to feed the people. And they have continued to do what they have done generation after generation, year after year, returning to these waters to feed us. And we often ask the question of ourselves, have we lived up to our side of that contract? Did we share that contract with the people that came here? Did they understand that there was a contract, an agreement? You look after them, they will look after you. The kind people, the cedar, gave of themselves in every way that they could give of themselves to us. They were the timber that we would build our houses with. Their bark provided us clothes and fiber for rope. They were our means of transportation in our large ocean-going dugout canoes. They were the kind people. We harvested from them when they were still standing. We would strip boards off of them, we'd strip cedar bark off of them, and they would continue to be generous of themselves to us. And that was the relationship that we had. And so it is absolutely devastating in the role that I'm in now, as I'm working in the provincial government, to know that our relationship to those two specific species, to the salmon, the Saanich, and to the cedar, the Hapay, that we no longer live up to our side of that responsibility, that we no longer fulfill our duty to them to look after them. You look after them, and they will continue to look after you. And they must be looking at us saying, what about that deal that we had? When did you forget that deal? And there's a story that is very similar to one that I was raised with in Sunday school, the story of the flood. Cant came down on the beach and he saw that the people were not living in a good way any longer. They were forgetting the teachings of Cant, the creator, transformer. And he said to the families on the beach, he said, you have to prepare your rope. There's a great flood coming. Prepare your canoes, prepare your family, prepare your food. Be ready because there's a great flood coming. And some of the families laughed and said that there was no great flood coming. They did not believe Cant's warning. Other families prepared the rope, the cedar ropes, and they made long cedar rope, and they coiled them up dutifully, listening to Cant's, listening to the teachings. And when the floods came, they were prepared and they were ready, and they got into their canoes, and they floated up with the water, and they tied their canoes together in a community of canoes, and they tied themselves off to a large arbutus tree on one of the mountains here. And they survived the flood. And as the ocean water, as the flood waters were receding, they saw one of the tops of the mountains. They said, "Nikwanit the Saanich." Look at the land that is emerging, he said. "Nikwanit Saanich." Look at the emerging waters. And that's how we got the name Saanich. Saanich means the emerging people. It means the emerging land. And I often joke about it. It's not surprising to the Saanich people why Elizabeth May and the Greens were elected first in Saanich Gulf Islands. This place has always been emerging. This place has always been the home of the emerging people. And we gave the name, or the name was given to the mountain, Mount Newton, Llewelyn. Llewelyn is the name of a place of refuge. It's called the place of refuge. And I told the story that we gave that name to the school on Saanich, on West Saanich Road, the school that my daughter goes to, Llewelyn School. And our elders were having a conversation about what they should name that new school. And they made the decision that they were going to bring the name from the mountain and they were going to put it on the school because it was a place of refuge for our children, Klewongo, where they could learn their teachings and they could learn their language and that they could be reminded of where they've come from and who they are. And the analogy of the ancient flood and the modern flood is not one that's lost on us. There was a modern flood that came, that our kids now have to overcome, and that now we have to overcome. And that flood came with the European boats that came not too long ago here in this part of the world, only a couple hundred years ago at the most. And as European boats started to show up on our shores, they brought with them a very colonial perspective that we didn't share here, that we didn't have here before. A different relationship with nature, a different relationship with those plants and animals, the trees. One which was, these are resources to be harvested for our benefit. And not only for our benefit, not actually for our benefit, for the benefit of the crown. And the men that they sent here on those boats were representatives of the Hudson's Bay Company, the HBC. They weren't even representatives of the Queen's family or the King's family. They were representatives of a corporation and corporate interests. But they came with a colonial perspective. And they left, and they came here and put in place a government that has a very colonial structure. The pin that I wear, I didn't wear it tonight, but the pin that I wear has a crown and a mace. The crown always reminds us who we have to seek the blessing of, to do anything that we do in this province. And the mace reminds us of where the power is. If there was ever an earthquake in that building down, I affectionately call it the rock pile on Belleville. If there was ever an earthquake and that mace was buried in that pile, there would be no authority for us to hold a meeting anywhere else in this province. We would have to first dig that mace out or seek the blessing of the crown to replace it with another mace. If you have your hands on that mace, you have the hands on the power that has been vested by the crown to govern in this province. We have a democracy in this country. We have a democracy in this province, but it is only so by the blessing of the crown. It is only so because we have a mace. Every legislature in the Commonwealth has a mace. Without that mace, there is no power. There is no government. There is no authority to govern. And so it's important that we understand that we have inherited this governance structure, and it's been placed over top of this place that has and has had in the past other different governance structures that have served it well in the years, up until the point that it changed, and as did our relationship to the resources in this province, the Hpé, the state. We still harvest those resources for the benefit of somebody else. We still harvest those resources for the benefit of corporate interests. That still exists to this day. And it's done through the power and the authority that's granted through the mace and the crown, the button that I wear every day. And I was asked when I swore an oath to the crown, how? How could you possibly swear an oath to the crown? How could you possibly promise to act on behalf of the Queen? And I said, the Queen made a commitment, that family made a commitment to the families in Saanich and to all the families in the Commonwealth, that they would act on their behalf and that they would do it in an honorable way and that they would look after all of the subjects within the realm. And they haven't done that. And so I swear an oath to this. I swear an oath to that notion that we have a responsibility to everybody that lives within this place. And the Indigenous people have not had that kind of relationship. The Racist Indian Act is an example of how some aspects of the honor has been overlooked. And so as I work on behalf of the people of British Columbia, I do it with the motivation in mind that I will do it on behalf of all of the people of British Columbia. And I've been trying to write this in a blog post for a while, and it's been really difficult for me to get it out because it's complex and because there's a lot of pitfalls. But really the interests of Indigenous people and the interests of the broader community are the same. They're the same interests. They are that we can live alongside one another, that our children can thrive, that they can have the benefits and the opportunities that all of the other kids have, that our future generations will be well looked after, and that the communities that we live in will be safe and secure. None of those interests are any different. And we've gone along in this country with the belief, and in this province with the belief that the interests are different. And it's that difference which has been largely defined by the Indian Act legislation. We were talking earlier about the Indian Act, and this is where I'm going to take a little sidestep for a second, because there was this interesting conversation that happened at the Green Party of Canada conference, and it was that we're going to be the first party to say that we're just going to get rid of the Indian Act. And I said, whoa, hold on a second here. Hold on. Just because we don't like it doesn't mean that you get to unilaterally get rid of it. That's the exact same action as the unilateral action to implement it. There is not an Indigenous person alive right now that isn't an Indian Act Indian. So much of the governance structures that we have in place are here, and how we perceive the governance structures of those communities are captured in that document. At least give the Indigenous people of this country the opportunity to work their way through this, how to work our way out of this without, just because the broader community, the broader country doesn't want it anymore, doesn't mean that the best way of getting rid of it is just to throw it out and replace it with what? So this brings me to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I did write a blog post about this one. And I immediately got hammered by comments from people who were saying, well, the United Nations, globalists, we can't do anything that they want. We have to throw everything that they do out, or an awful group. And I said, fine. Let's call it the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People then. Let's forget that the UN did this. Let's recognize that this document represents the basic human rights, the acknowledgement and the recognition of basic human rights that Indigenous people in this country have not been granted. Let's recognize that the process that the UN did undertake was a deliberative democratic process over decades to arrive at 45 or 46, I think, articles which basically identify all the aspects of that would allow for Indigenous people and give Indigenous people the ability to determine their future, which is something that we all wish for ourselves, that we all wish for our family members, that we all wish for each other. The ability to make decisions for ourselves and not being told how you get to be, how you are governed, and, well, a huge amount of rules that are a huge number of rules that are in place that really do not benefit people. There has been a lot of discomfort around the discussion around the United Nations, the UNDRIP. I just want to be clear about a couple of things here. The UNDRIP doesn't give any new rights to Indigenous people. This is a really important piece that needs to be repeated over and over and over again. There are no new rights. The Canadian court system, our judicial system, has been ruling on consent and the Indigenous people's right to make decisions about their territory since back in the 1960s. Since, by the way, Indigenous people were allowed to hire a lawyer to defend themselves. Not that long ago in this country. Before that, an Indigenous person could not hire a lawyer to represent their interests or their rights. So, what we're actually talking about here is formalizing the process which the courts told us back in the 1990s, if you don't deal with this, if you force us to deal with this, it's not going to end well. It's better if you do this in a collaborative process where everybody's at the table and you are working together. You are reconciling the past. This has always been, according to the courts, it's always been a discussion about consent, questions about consent. And probably the stickiest aspect of the UNDRIP is this notion of free, prior, and informed consent. And I want to dispel some myths here tonight about this, because this FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent, has been utterly and totally abused, in my opinion. First of all, what part of our society right now is it acceptable to operate without free, prior, and informed consent? Is there anything that I can do to somebody else that doesn't require me to have a mature conversation about free, prior, and informed consent? I would state boldly that only in the conversation about Indigenous people and Indigenous rights is it okay in this country to question free, prior, and informed consent. And that's something that we actually have to reconcile amongst ourselves. We have to understand that I can't think of another example where it would be okay for me to act without the consent of others if they're involved. So I just want to be clear about that. The other piece about this around veto, so those who are concerned about the government, the colonial government, losing full power and control of the decision-making over the land, will use arguments about veto. We can't give we can't give the right to veto to Indigenous people, so that they're the only interests or concerns that are being determined in a decision that's made. Free, prior, and informed consent is not a veto. So let's consider a veto. First, let's look at the veto power that the president has down in the United States. Congress does a bunch of work over in a house over here. They come up with a finished product. They vote on it. They approve it. Then it gets taken in a car over to the president. Gets put on his, or maybe in the future her, desk. And they read it, or not. And then they have the ability to say no. That is a veto. Free, prior, and informed consent is we get together at a table, all of the interested parties are sitting in their rightful places at that table, all of the pertinent information is put on the table, we have a mature conversation about it with everybody and all of the interests there from the very beginning. The concerns are brought up, the program is adjusted, there's a negotiating and a consultation and a full engagement, and there's a couple of different outcomes. Yeah, let's proceed. No, we're not going to proceed. Yes, we might proceed under a different kind of regime if we continue to have this conversation. So there's some clear differences between free, prior, and informed consent and a veto. It doesn't mean under free, prior, and informed consent that everything that the corporate or colonial interests or indigenous interests want to have go ahead. There is a way for things to not happen, but it doesn't happen at the end. It's not like we've done all this work, it's great work, it's colonial work, and now the indigenous people are standing in the way of it, which is the perception that a lot of people want British Columbians to believe in order to make the UNDRIP unpalatable. But really, the UNDRIP is the most important thing that we can do in our steps towards decolonization and reconciliation. By forcing our government structures, which are entirely colonial in nature, to begin to decolonize, and this is not talking about necessarily the Commonwealth, but by forcing our government structure to start to look at the interests of the people that we are elected to serve, and making sure that it serves those interests, and not some sort of foreign corporate interest or a different interest of another party outside of this place. We can begin to govern this place with those interests at the center and at the heart. So the decolonization process that the UNDRIP is enabling in this country is not just about indigenous people. It's about all of us. It's about your relationship with indigenous people. It's about your relationship with yourself. And it's about your relationship with nature. And we can be thankful for the fact that the indigenous people of this country and those rights and those court cases and the situation that we're in is giving us this opportunity to be able to move away from the colonial mindset in this country, which is one that is really based around can't do. Can't do that. You wouldn't believe how many times I hear, I can't do that. We want to do A, can't do it, that's federal. We'd like to do B, can't do it, that's provincial. We'd like to do C, can't do it, gonna have to talk to the local government about it. And I represent Saanich and the Gulf Islands. And in the Gulf Islands, we have the Islands Trust. So now I've got a whole other level of can't do. Can't do because we don't have a municipal government. Can't do because the Islands Trust doesn't allow us to do it. And don't hear this as me talking from a perspective that I think that we should do everything. I'm actually a guy that thinks we should probably do a lot less than what we're actually doing. But the can't do attitude that we have is one that is designed in a colonial framework. Of course, the Crown wants us to believe that we have the ability to do a lot of things. But really, the Crown wants us to only be able to do the things that they're willing to give the royal nod for. And that's what happens when the Lieutenant Governor comes into the legislature and they read off a list of the acts that we've all approved and voted on that don't become law in this country, or in this province, until the Lieutenant Governor, who's great, by the way, she's Janet Austin, her honor's learning Sanchothan and is speaking Sanchothan in the legislature. Like, this is a phenomenal achievement. But until she goes like this, nothing that we do on your behalf is going to be done on your behalf. So what authority and power do the elected officials in this province and in this country actually have if we can't pass a law until there's royal assent to that law? And that's how the system works. But it is important to acknowledge that the can't-do attitude is one that we have inherited from a long time ago, and we can do what is allowed to be done, and other than that, there's a very frustrating framework of other people that you need to go and talk to, which is a distraction from actually being able to accomplish much. So this journey of reconciliation that we're on in this country is one that is allowing us to reconcile our relationships with Indigenous people. It's allowing us to learn how to reconcile our relationship to ourselves and our place in this world. And it's giving us the opportunity to reconcile our relationship with nature and the environment. And this is the part where decarbonization comes in to this conversation. Because really, what's happening to our environment has been one in which we have a situation where we extract resources for the benefit of the HBC. That's where it started. The Crown, but it was the HBC that they sent here on the boats. We are now in a situation where we have resource extraction on the behalf of multinational corporations. But really they might be you. If you're shareholders in them, it's probably it's you as well. And we've seen devastation of our trees, we've seen devastation of our water, we've seen devastation of our fish, and we're seeing our oil resources absolutely devastated. To the point where we have, in the last 100 years, extracted more than our fair share, and we've put more of our fair share of pollution back. You look after them, and they look after you. Part of the contract wasn't, you look after them, and then they'll dump a bunch of garbage on top of your head. That wasn't the agreement that was made a long time ago. I wrote a blog post maybe a year and a half ago where I called British Columbia a resource colony. And ResourceWorks, which is a group of folks, probably very nice folks, really was uncomfortable with me classifying us as the colonial outpost, the resource colony. But that's really what we were. The last resource colony of Great Britain was British Columbia. They stopped their efforts ceased after this. In fact, when James Douglas was signing treaties, which is what he was instructed to do on behalf of the Crown as an HBC man, they were running out of cash, and so they had to stop signing treaties and they had to find a different approach, and that's when Joseph Trutch and gang came through and completely upended the whole process, and it was back to the perspective that terra nullius and doctrine of discovery, and we'll just kind of pretend that the royal proclamation didn't happen, and we're just going to proceed with extracting the resources as quickly and as mightily as we possibly can. So I want to just highlight that I think that we're at a point, I'll end with this. We're at a point in this province where we can embrace the opportunity that we have in front of us. We can embrace the opportunity for the first time in 160 or 170 years to change the relationship with the Indigenous people that were clearly here. There is no such thing as of discovery of this land. This land was well inhabited long before Europeans showed up. We can embrace the opportunity that this process is teaching us and be thankful for the fact that we can actually broaden and deepen decolonization of ourselves and of our relationship to nature. And that we can take this reconciliation process that we're in and we can modify and change and modernize our society, modernize our economy, and ultimately decarbonize in the face of rapid climate change and the climate emergency that we're facing. And I want to encourage everybody that chose to be here tonight, and I thank you for choosing to do this rather than choosing to do something else, like play bridge. We won't tell them that you're playing hooky from bridge tonight. I got elected in 2008 to Central Saanich Council This was pre-Idle No More. I was the first on-reserve living person of Indigenous mixed heritage to get elected in the municipality of Central Saanich. When I went to the UBCM that year, I was one of 2 self-identifying Indigenous people in a crowd of hundreds, maybe 1,000. Harry Neese was the only other person, and he was elected to the regional district up in Nisga'a territory. In that first election in 2008, I barely mentioned where I was from. People knew, but I didn't bring it up. It was not, I didn't lead with it, let's just put it that way. In 2011, when I got reelected, I got asked a question at an all-candidates meeting. So you've been to all-candidates meetings, I think, probably. So they're not debates, they're meetings. And there was, 18 of us or something on the stage, get asked a question, 22 seconds to answer it, move on. Everybody gets a chance, except for me. Yep. So the moderator said, we're going to take a break from asking everybody the questions, and we're just going to ask a question to Adam Olsen. So, why don't you pay property taxes? And I thought, that's classic, right? Real special treatment. So I was prepared for it, of course, because I was, I knew that something like this, it wasn't at the door, maybe it was at a candidates meeting, but it was bold to ask me at a candidate meeting. But right in front of everybody, I said, well, like all the other residents in the crowd tonight, I just want to assure you that I pay every single penny of taxes that I'm entitled to pay. Right. And I'm sure that there's not a bunch of people out here in the crowd tonight paying a bunch of taxes that you're not entitled to pay. There is no place for me to pay property taxes, and if you would like to change that, then I encourage you to talk to your member of parliament, because the Indian Act could use a revision. In 2013, I ran for the BC Green Party for the first time in Saanich North in the Islands. And just before that, in December of 2012, Indigenous people started to take their drums and walk into public spaces and sing their songs. And it was bold. It was called Idle No More. And for me, it was the change, the pivot point in the history of our country. Because after the first couple of weeks of Indigenous people singing their songs in public spaces, when we attended a lot, we started to see non-Indigenous people standing around the outside, curious, listening, engaging. And then after that, they started to move closer to the center. And then one of the singers with a drum got so bold as to say, here, why don't you drum with us? And hey, why don't you learn this song with us? And by the end of it, in February of 2013, we were singing and drumming together. And there was some vile things written on local media stories about the threat, the existential threat to our colonialism that this was posing us. And then there was an onslaught of protection that was provided by people who were singing and drumming that were not of Indigenous ancestry in defense of what was going on. And it was the beginning of a change in this country that we've not looked back from. And so I want to encourage everyone that's here tonight to embrace that. We are doing it. Reconciliation is not something that is going to happen. Reconciliation in this country is something that is happening. The fact that you're sitting here tonight is an example of it. The fact that climate change is an important part of the narrative of this federal election that we're having right now and decarbonization of our economy and of our society and of our world and of our atmosphere, the fact that that is a major piece of conversation, a focal point of the conversation in this federal election, is an example that we are reconciling our relationship with nature and with ourselves. It might not be quick enough, it might not be deep enough, but it's happening. So I just encourage you to embrace it, and to encourage our provincial government to continue on the path of embracing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, so that we can institute in the fact that those ministries, those deputy ministers, the assistant deputy ministers, and every member of the bureaucracy and of our public service needs to begin to implement changes within the way that we see ourselves, the colonial mindset that we have, and that we can embrace this change, and that we can institutionalize the change. Thank you.